The morning sky was barely turning blue when Rose Miller walked into Pete's Diner on the corner of Main Street. It was a Tuesday, nothing special about it. Just another day in the small town of Riverdale where everyone knew everyone, and the biggest excitement was when someone got a new car or painted their house a different color. Rose was 32, worked as a nurse at the local clinic, and lived alone in a modest apartment with her cat, Mr. Whiskers. She wasn't rich by any means, but she made enough to get by and even put a little aside each month. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore minimal makeup. She didn't stand out in a crowd, and that was just fine with her. "The usual, Rose?" asked Betty, the waitress who had been serving her breakfast for the past 5 years. "Yes, please. Coffee, black, and a blueberry muffin to go." Rose checked her watch. She had 20 minutes before her shift started. Plenty of time to enjoy her coffee at the counter instead of rushing out. She took a sip, savoring the warmth and bitterness that would get her through the first few hours of work. As she sat there, the bell above the door chimed, and a man walked in. Rose didn't pay much attention at first. But as he shuffled past her to the far end of the counter, she couldn't help but notice him. He wasn't like the other regulars. His clothes were worn and dirty, with a military-style jacket that had seen better days. His beard was long and unkempt, and his hands, when he placed them on the counter, were rough and calloused. But what caught Rose's attention most were his eyes, blue eyes that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 untold stories. He sat down quietly, almost as if trying not to be noticed. Betty approached him with a menu, but her usual warm smile seemed a bit forced. "Just coffee, please," the man said in a low voice. "How much is that?" $2, Betty replied. The man reached into his pocket and pulled out some change, counting it carefully. Rose could see his face fall slightly as he counted. He was short. "I'm sorry," he said, pushing the coins forward. "This is all I have. Maybe just half a cup?" Betty looked uncomfortable. Pete, the owner, had strict rules about customers paying full price. Rose watched as Betty hesitated, torn between compassion and policy. Without thinking twice, Rose spoke up. "I've got it, Betty. His coffee and..." She looked at the man. "Would you like something to eat too?" The man seemed startled, as if unused to being addressed directly, let alone offered help. "No, thank you, ma'am. The coffee is more than enough. It's breakfast time, and Pete's makes the best pancakes in town." "I'm already getting one for myself," Rose lied smoothly. "It's no trouble." Something in her voice must have conveyed that she wouldn't take no for an answer, because after a moment's hesitation, the man nodded. "That's very kind of you. Thank you." "Make that 2 specials, Betty," Rose said, moving over to sit beside the stranger. If Betty was surprised, she didn't show it, just nodded and called the order back to the kitchen. "I'm Rose," she said, extending her hand. The man's handshake was firm but brief. "Tom," he replied. "Tom Walker. Nice to meet you, Tom. Are you just passing through Riverdale?" Tom took a sip of his coffee before answering. "Sort of. Been moving around a lot lately." Rose nodded, not pushing for more information. They sat in comfortable silence until Betty brought their pancakes. Rose watched from the corner of her eye as Tom cut his food into small, precise bites, eating methodically. Military habits, she thought. "You serve?" she asked casually. Tom looked up, surprise flickering across his face. "Yes, ma'am. Marines. 2 tours in Afghanistan. My dad was in the army," Rose said. "Served in Desert Storm." A hint of a smile crossed Tom's face. "Good man, I'm sure." "He was," Rose agreed. "Passed away 5 years ago. Cancer." "I'm sorry to hear that." They fell into conversation then, nothing too personal, just small talk about the town, the weather, neutral topics. Rose noticed that Tom avoided talking about himself, deflecting questions with polite brevity. She didn't mind. Everyone had their stories, their secrets. By the time they finished eating, Rose was running late for her shift. "I've got to run," she said, leaving enough money on the counter to cover both meals and a generous tip. "It was nice meeting you, Tom." Tom looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time. "Thank you for breakfast, Rose. And for sitting with me. It's been a while since I had company for a meal." Something in his voice tugged at her heart. "Pete's is open every day," she said with a smile. "Maybe I'll see you around." Tom nodded, but didn't commit one way or another. Rose hurried out of the diner, already mentally preparing for her day at the clinic. By noon, the encounter with the homeless veteran had faded to the back of her mind, pressed aside by the demands of her job. She didn't think about Tom again until she was walking home that evening. Would he have found a safe place to sleep? Did he have access to services for veterans? Rose knew that many who served came back with wounds that weren't visible, carrying burdens most civilians couldn't understand. Her apartment felt especially quiet that night. Mr. Whiskers curled up on her lap as she watched TV, but Rose found her mind wandering. She thought about Tom, about her father, about the sacrifices people made that often went unnoticed and unappreciated. Before going to bed, she made a mental note to stop by the local Veteran Support Center during her lunch break tomorrow. Maybe they could help if Tom was still in town. It wasn't much, but it was something. Rose fell asleep that night with the comfortable feeling that comes from small acts of kindness, unaware that her simple gesture at the diner would set in motion events that would change her life forever. The next morning followed her usual routine. Alarm at 6:30 a.m., shower, dress, feed Mr. Whiskers, grab her purse, and head out the door by 7:15. She was halfway to Pete's diner when she realized she'd forgotten her phone and turned back. That's when she noticed the car. A black SUV with government plates, parked directly in front of her apartment building. Not a common sight in Riverdale. As Rose approached her building, two men in crisp military uniforms stepped out of the vehicle. "Ms. Miller," one of them called out. "Rose Miller?" Rose stopped, her heart suddenly pounding. "Yes? Can I help you?" "Ma'am, we're with the United States Marine Corps. We need to speak with you regarding an urgent matter." Rose's mind raced. What could the military possibly want with her? She wasn't a veteran. She had no immediate family in the service. Unless... "Is this about Tom?" she asked, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "The man from the diner?" The officers exchanged a glance. "Ms. Miller, may we come inside? What we need to discuss is of a sensitive nature." Rose looked at her watch. She was going to be late for work, but somehow that didn't seem important anymore. "Of course," she said, leading them toward her apartment building. As she fumbled with her keys, questions swirled in her mind. Who was Tom Walker really? And what had she unknowingly become part of by buying a simple breakfast for a homeless veteran? Rose led the two officers into her small apartment, suddenly aware of the unwashed coffee mug on the counter and Mr. Whiskers' toys scattered across the floor. The cat himself darted under the couch, eyeing the strangers with suspicion. "Please, have a seat," she said, gesturing to her modest living room. The officers remained standing. "This won't take long, ma'am," said the taller of the two. His nameplate read Johnson. "I'm Lieutenant Johnson, and this is Sergeant Rivera. We're here about Thomas Walker." Rose's hands trembled slightly as she set her purse down. "Is he in some kind of trouble?" "No, ma'am," Lieutenant Johnson replied. "But we have reason to believe you had contact with him yesterday." "At Pete's diner?" Rose nodded. "Yes, I bought him breakfast. He seemed down on his luck. Is he okay?" The officers exchanged glances again. Sergeant Rivera pulled out a photograph and handed it to Rose. "Is this the man you met?" The photo showed a younger, clean-shaven version of Tom in full military dress uniform. His eyes were the same, intense blue, but without the weariness she had noticed at the diner. "Yes, that's him. Though he looks different now. Older. More." She searched for the right word, worn. Lieutenant Johnson nodded. "Ms. Miller, what you did yesterday morning set off a chain of events that has national security implications." Rose felt her stomach drop. "What do you mean?" "I just bought him breakfast." "Thomas Walker isn't just any veteran," Sergeant Rivera explained. "He was one of our most decorated intelligence officers. After his second tour, he was recruited for special operations, classified work." Rose sank onto the arm of her sofa. "I don't understand. Why is he homeless then? And what does this have to do with me?" "He's not homeless, Ms. Miller," Lieutenant Johnson said. "At least, not in the way you think. Walker went off the grid 3 years ago after a mission went sideways. His entire team was lost, and he was the only survivor. The trauma, it changed him. He disappeared before he could be properly debriefed. He's been avoiding contact with the military and his family ever since. We've been searching for him," Sergeant Rivera added. "Not to punish him, but to help him. He has information that could save lives, and he needs medical attention for his PTSD." Rose thought back to their brief conversation, how Tom had avoided personal questions, how his hands had trembled slightly when holding his coffee cup. It made sense now. "After you bought him breakfast and spoke with him, something changed," Lieutenant Johnson continued. "He called a secure line that had been dormant for years, a line only he knew about. He asked for me personally." "For you?" Rose was struggling to keep up. "I was his commanding officer. He said he's ready to come in, but only under certain conditions." A tense silence filled the room. Rose realized they were waiting for her to ask. "What conditions?" "He wants to meet with you present," Sergeant Rivera said. "He said the kindness you showed him, with no agenda, no questions asked, it reminded him of why he served in the first place. To protect people like you." Rose felt a lump forming in her throat. "Me? But I didn't do anything special." "Sometimes the smallest gestures have the biggest impact, Ms. Miller," Lieutenant Johnson said, his formal tone softening slightly. "Walker has been living with ghosts for 3 years. What you did, it might seem small to you, but to a man who's lost faith in humanity, in himself, it was enough to bring him back." Mr. Whiskers chose that moment to emerge from under the couch, rubbing against Rose's legs as if sensing her distress. "So what happens now?" she asked, absently stroking the cat's fur. "If you're willing, we'd like you to come with us. Walker is waiting at a secure location just outside of town. He's agreed to turn over crucial intelligence and accept medical help, but only if you're there." Rose glanced at her watch again. Her shift at the clinic would start in 15 minutes. People were counting on her. "Can I make a phone call first? I need to let work know I won't be coming in today." Lieutenant Johnson nodded. "Of course. And Ms. Miller? This conversation is classified. You can tell your employer you're taking a personal day, but nothing else." As Rose reached for her phone, her mind was spinning. Yesterday, she was just a small-town nurse with a predictable life. Today, somehow, she was involved in a matter of national security. All because she'd bought breakfast for a stranger. "Just one more thing," she said, pausing with her phone in hand. "How did you find me? I never told Tom my last name or where I lived." Sergeant Rivera smiled slightly. "He's an intelligence officer, Ms. Miller. Finding people is what he does." Rose shivered, wondering just what she had gotten herself into, and what awaited her at this secure location outside of town. The black SUV wound through country roads Rose had driven countless times, yet today they seemed unfamiliar, as if she had crossed into another world. Lieutenant Johnson drove while Sergeant Rivera sat in the passenger seat, occasionally speaking into a secure radio in hushed tones. "We're approaching the location," Lieutenant Johnson announced after nearly 30 minutes of driving. They turned onto an unmarked dirt road that led to what appeared to be an ordinary farmhouse, though Rose noticed the discreet security cameras mounted along the perimeter. Her heart pounded as they pulled up to the house. This was real. Not some movie, not some story. Her simple act of kindness had somehow entangled her in something much bigger than herself. "He's inside," Sergeant Rivera said, opening her door. "Remember, he requested you specifically. You don't have to say anything if you don't want to. Just your presence might be enough." Rose nodded, smoothing down her nurse's uniform that now seemed out of place in this clandestine setting. She followed the officers up the porch steps, flinching slightly when the door opened before they could knock. A woman in plain clothes but with an unmistakable military bearing nodded at them. "They're in the back room. He's been waiting." They walked through the house, which was sparsely furnished but equipped with various communications devices. At the end of a hallway, Lieutenant Johnson paused before a closed door and looked at Rose. "Ready?" She took a deep breath and nodded. He knocked once, then opened the door. The room was simple: a table, 4 chairs, and a window overlooking fields of corn. Tom sat with his back to the wall, facing the door. He looked different from yesterday. He'd shaved, and his clothes were clean, though his eyes still carried that haunted look. Across from him sat an older man in a suit that practically screamed government official. When Tom saw Rose, something in his expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but a softening around the eyes. "You came," he said quietly. "Of course," Rose replied, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. "Are you okay?" The suited man cleared his throat. "Ms. Miller, I'm Director Blackwood with the Defense Intelligence Agency. Thank you for agreeing to this unusual meeting. Please, have a seat." Rose sat down next to Tom, noticing the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers tapped rhythmically on the table, signs of anxiety she recognized from her nursing training. "Yesterday at the diner," Tom said, his voice low, "when you sat with me, talked to me like a person, not a problem to be solved or a threat to be managed, it was the first normal interaction I've had in 3 years." He looked down at his hands, now still. "After what happened in Kandahar, after losing my team, I couldn't face anyone. Not my superiors, not the families of the men who died. I've been carrying information that could prevent something similar from happening again, but I couldn't. I wasn't ready." Tom looked directly at Rose. "Until yesterday. Something as simple as shared pancakes and conversation reminded me why the truth matters. Why I need to finish this, even if it means facing my own demons." Director Blackwood leaned forward. "We're ready when you are, Walker." Tom nodded, then turned to Rose with a question in his eyes. "I'll stay," she said, understanding what he needed without him having to ask. "For as long as you need." The next 3 hours passed in a blur for Rose. Tom spoke in a steady voice, occasionally using military terminology she didn't understand. She gathered that his team had uncovered something during their last mission, evidence of weapons being sold to terrorist cells by someone within the U.S. military's own ranks. "We had names, dates, account numbers," Tom explained, pushing a flash drive across the table to Director Blackwood. "Everything needed to expose the entire network." That's when the ambush happened. His voice faltered for the first time. Under the table, Rose instinctively reached for his hand. He seemed startled by the contact but didn't pull away. "We were compromised from the inside," Tom continued. "Someone didn't want that information getting back to headquarters. My team, good men, the best I've ever served with, they died protecting this intel." Director Blackwood examined the flash drive. And you've been carrying this for 3 years? Why not come in sooner? Tom's jaw tightened. Because I didn't know who to trust. The person who set us up had high-level clearance. Until I knew who was behind it, turning this over could have meant burying it forever. Or worse. What changed? Lieutenant Johnson asked. Tom glanced at Rose, then back to the director. I've been monitoring certain channels, watching for patterns. 2 months ago, I identified the man responsible, Colonel Howard Reeves. He was transferred to Pentagon oversight last year. The name meant nothing to Rose, but she felt the atmosphere in the room shift. Director Blackwood's expression darkened as he made notes. You have proof? Tom nodded. It's all there. Encrypted, but the passcode is my daughter's birthday. Rose felt a jolt of surprise. Tom had a daughter. This man who she had thought was just a homeless veteran had a family somewhere, people who probably missed him terribly. With your permission, sir, Tom addressed Director Blackwood, I'd like to explain to Ms. Miller why I'm sharing this now. She deserves to know what her kindness set in motion. The director nodded, standing up. Take your time. We'll begin processing this information immediately. He gestured to Lieutenant Johnson and Sergeant Rivera, and the 3 men left the room, closing the door behind them. Alone with Tom, Rose waited. He released her hand gently and rubbed his face, suddenly looking exhausted. I'm sorry you got pulled into this, he said. When I saw you at the diner, you reminded me of someone, my late wife, Lisa. Not in how you look, but in that instinct to reach out, to help without questioning why. He pulled out a worn photograph from his pocket and handed it to Rose. A woman with a warm smile held a little girl of about 5, both laughing at the camera. Lisa died of cancer 6 years ago. Our daughter, Amy, lives with my sister in Colorado. I haven't seen her in 3 years, couldn't risk it while Reeves was still out there, still dangerous. Rose studied the photo, understanding washing over her. You were protecting them by staying away. Tom nodded, his eyes glistening. After what happened yesterday, I realized something. I've been so focused on the danger, on what I lost, that I forgot what I was fighting for in the first place. People like you, like Amy. Good people living ordinary lives. He took a deep breath. It's time to finish this. Time to go home. A soft knock on the door interrupted their conversation. Sergeant Rivera poked his head in. Excuse me, but Director Blackwood needs to speak with Walker immediately. It's urgent. Tom stood up, handing Rose back the photograph. Wait here? She nodded, watching as he followed Sergeant Rivera out of the room. Through the partially open door, she could hear urgent voices and rapid movement. Something was happening. Rose sat alone for 20 minutes, anxiety building with each passing moment. When the door finally opened again, it wasn't Tom but Lieutenant Johnson who entered. Ms. Miller, we need to move you to a different location. Rose stood up, alarmed by his tone. Why? What's happened? The information Walker provided has been partially decoded. It appears Colonel Reeves has been tipped off. He checked his watch. We have reason to believe he's mobilizing resources to contain the situation. Contain? Rose repeated, her nurse's mind automatically translating the euphemism. You mean silence anyone who knows. Lieutenant Johnson didn't confirm or deny. We're moving you and Walker to a secure military facility. Please come with me now. As they hurried down the hallway, Rose caught glimpses of controlled chaos, people packing equipment, shredding documents, making calls. They entered a room where Tom stood with Director Blackwood, both bent over a laptop. We've got confirmation, the director was saying. Reeves accessed the security system 6 minutes ago. He knows we're here. Tom looked up, his expression tightening when he saw Rose. Get her out first, he insisted. She's a civilian. None of this is her fight. It became her fight when you involved her, Director Blackwood countered, but not unkindly. Don't worry, Walker. We're evacuating everyone. Outside, Rose heard the distinctive sound of helicopter blades cutting through the air. Her small-town life seemed impossibly distant now, as if it belonged to someone else entirely. Ms. Miller, Director Blackwood addressed her directly. I'm sorry about this complication. We're taking you to Fort Carson. You'll be safe there until this is resolved. How long will that be? She asked, thinking of her job, her apartment, Mr. Whiskers. A few days at most, Tom answered before the director could. I promise, we'll make this right. Rose wanted to believe him, but the gravity in everyone's faces told her this was far from a routine precaution. Still, she had come this far. I understand. Within minutes, they were outside, crouching against the downdraft as they ran toward the waiting helicopter. Tom stayed close to Rose, one hand protectively on her back. As they climbed aboard, she caught a glimpse of vehicles approaching in the distance, kicking up dust on the country road. The helicopter lifted off just as the first black SUV reached the perimeter of the farmhouse. Rose watched through the window as armed men in tactical gear poured out of the vehicles. That was close, Sergeant Rivera murmured, securing Rose's seatbelt for her. Tom's eyes met hers across the helicopter cabin. In them, she saw a mixture of regret and resolve. I'm sorry, he mouthed over the roar of the engine. Rose didn't reply. What could she say? 24 hours ago, her biggest concern had been making it to work on time. Now she was fleeing in a military helicopter from men who wanted to silence her. All because she'd bought breakfast for a stranger. Fort Carson loomed in the distance, a sprawling military complex nestled against the Rocky Mountains. The helicopter touched down on a landing pad where a team was waiting. Rose's legs felt wobbly as she stepped onto solid ground, the events of the day catching up with her. Ms. Miller, I'm Captain Chen, a woman in uniform greeted her. I'll be your liaison while you're here. If you need anything at all, just let me know. Rose nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. She watched as Tom was immediately surrounded by other officers and whisked away toward a nearby building. Will I get to see him again? She asked Captain Chen. Of course. But first, Director Blackwood has arranged for you to make a supervised call home. I understand you have a cat. The mention of Mr. Whiskers brought tears to Rose's eyes. In all the chaos, she hadn't had time to worry about him. Yes, he needs to be fed. We've arranged for someone to check on him, Captain Chen assured her. You can give feeding instructions during your call. Captain Chen led Rose to a small, bare room with a secure phone. Rose called her neighbor, Mrs. Patel, who agreed to look after Mr. Whiskers. She couldn't explain much, just that she'd been called away on an unexpected family emergency. How long will you be gone, dear? Mrs. Patel asked. Rose hesitated, looking at Captain Chen, who held up 3 fingers. About 3 days, Rose answered, hoping it was true. Thank you so much for helping. After the call, Captain Chen escorted her to a small but comfortable room in what appeared to be guest quarters. You should rest. It's been a long day. Someone will come for you when Director Blackwood is ready for the debriefing. Alone for the first time since the morning, Rose sat on the edge of the bed, trying to process everything. Her nursing uniform felt out of place here, a reminder of the normal life she'd been pulled from. She wondered what her co-workers thought of her sudden absence, what rumors might be spreading through the small town. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. When she opened the door, she found Tom standing there, now dressed in standard military fatigues. May I come in? He asked quietly. Rose stepped aside. Tom entered but remained standing, as if unsure of his welcome. I wanted to check on you, he said. This isn't what you signed up for when you bought me breakfast. Despite everything, Rose found herself smiling. No, it wasn't in the Pete's Diner menu description. The small joke broke some of the tension. Tom's shoulders relaxed slightly. They're moving quickly on the information I provided, he said. Colonel Reeves has been detained for questioning. His associates too. But they're powerful people with connections. Until everything is verified and secured, we need to stay here. Rose sat back on the bed. What happens after? Can you go back to your daughter? Tom's expression softened at the mention of Amy. That's the plan. My sister has been notified that I'm alive and coming home. She hasn't told Amy yet, too many disappointments already in that little girl's life. He moved to the window, looking out at the mountains. I missed 3 years of her life. She's 8 now. Children are resilient, Rose said gently. And they understand more than we give them credit for. Tom turned back to her. Director Blackwood wants to meet with both of us in an hour. They need your statement too, about how we met. Every detail matters for the official record. I'll be ready, Rose promised. As Tom headed for the door, he paused. Rose? Thank you. Not just for breakfast, but for being here. For not running when things got complicated. After he left, Rose lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. Not running? As if she'd had a choice. Yet somehow, despite the danger and disruption, she couldn't bring herself to regret her decision to buy breakfast for a homeless veteran. The debriefing room was windowless and sterile, with a long table surrounded by uncomfortable chairs. Rose sat beside Tom, facing Director Blackwood and 2 officers she hadn't met before. One introduced himself as General Patterson, the other as a JAG officer, military lawyer, named Major Brooks. Ms. Miller, Director Blackwood began, we need your account of how you met Walker. Start from the beginning, please. Rose recounted her morning at Pete's Diner, how Tom had come in looking disheveled, how he couldn't afford a full cup of coffee, how she'd offered to buy him breakfast. The details seemed so ordinary, so inconsequential compared to where they'd led. And he didn't tell you anything about his military background? Major Brooks asked. Only that he'd been a Marine, served 2 tours in Afghanistan. Nothing about intelligence work or classified missions. The JAG officer made notes. Did he mention Colonel Reeves or any names at all? No. Mostly he listened while I talked about the town. General Patterson leaned forward. Ms. Miller, I want to be clear about something. Your involvement in this matter was completely accidental, yet your actions may have helped uncover one of the most significant security breaches in recent military history. Rose glanced at Tom, who nodded slightly, encouraging her to understand the significance. Colonel Reeves' operation wasn't just selling weapons, the general continued. He was selling intelligence, locations of operatives, mission details, identities of informants. Lives were lost because of his betrayal. What happens now? Rose asked. We have enough evidence to convene a court-martial, Major Brooks explained. Colonel Reeves is facing serious charges, treason, conspiracy, accessory to murder. The investigation is expanding to his network. And our security status? Tom asked. Director Blackwood exchanged glances with the general. We believe the immediate threat has been neutralized. Reeves' key associates are in custody. That said, we recommend continued caution for a few months. What does that mean for Ms. Miller? Tom pressed. We'll arrange security monitoring for her home and workplace for 60 days, the director replied. Discreet, nothing that will disrupt her life further. After that, we reassess. Rose tried to imagine returning to her normal routine with military security watching from the shadows. It seemed surreal. There's one more thing, General Patterson said, sliding a folder across the table to Tom. These came through while you were being processed back into the system. Tom opened the folder, and Rose caught a glimpse of official-looking documents. His expression changed, surprised, then deeply moved. Back pay for 3 years, he explained quietly to Rose. And my honorable discharge has been processed. He looked up at the general. Thank you, sir. You've earned it, Walker. More than earned it. When can we go home? Rose asked, suddenly eager to return to her apartment, to Mr. Whiskers, to the predictable rhythm of her life at the clinic. Tomorrow morning, Director Blackwood answered. We'll have transport ready for both of you at 0800. As they left the debriefing room, Tom walked silently beside Rose, clutching the folder to his chest. Are you okay? She asked, and they were alone in the hallway. For the first time in 3 years, he said, his voice thick with emotion, I think I might be. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Fort Carson grounds as Rose and Tom boarded a nondescript black SUV. Gone was the urgency of their helicopter arrival. This was a quiet departure, almost anticlimactic after the drama of the past 2 days. Captain Chen handed Rose a small duffel bag. Clean clothes and some toiletries. We figured you might need them. Thank you, Rose said, touched by the thoughtfulness. She had been wearing the same nurse's uniform since leaving her apartment. We'll drop Ms. Miller at her home first, the driver announced as they pulled away from the base. Tom, sitting beside Rose in the back seat, looked out the window at the passing landscape. He seemed lost in thought, his fingers tapping nervously on his knee. Nervous about seeing Amy? Rose asked quietly. He nodded. My sister's bringing her to Riverdale tomorrow. I rented a small house on Oak Street, sight unseen, based on photos. The military helped expedite everything. He paused. What do you say to a child who thinks you abandoned her? The truth, Rose answered simply. As much as she can understand. They fell into comfortable silence for the remainder of the journey. When they finally reached Riverdale, Rose was surprised by how normal everything looked, the same storefronts, the same traffic lights, the same people going about their daily business, completely unaware of the national security drama that had unfolded just outside their town. The SUV pulled up in front of Rose's apartment building. Tom stepped out first, offering his hand to help her. It felt strange, this formal goodbye after everything they'd shared. Will you be okay? He asked, concern evident in his eyes. Rose smiled. I should be asking you that. I'm just going back to my normal life. You're starting over. Not entirely over, Tom said. Some parts of my old life are worth reclaiming. The driver transferred a small security case from the trunk to the second SUV that had followed them from Fort Carson. Rose recognized the case. It contained the flash drive with Tom's evidence. That's heading to Washington, Tom explained. The case will be built steadily, methodically. Justice doesn't always move quickly, but it will come. He hesitated, then added, I've been asked to consult during the investigation. I'll be traveling back and forth for a while. Rose nodded, understanding the implications. This wasn't truly over for him yet. Well, she said, suddenly awkward, I guess this is goodbye. Actually, Tom replied, I was hoping it might be more of a see you later. Maybe at Pete's Diner? I owe you a breakfast. Rose felt a smile spread across her face. I'd like that. I'll call you. Once Amy is settled. You don't have my number, Rose pointed out. Tom's lips quirked in a half-smile. Intelligence officer, remember? I'm pretty good at finding information when I need to. As the SUVs pulled away, Rose stood on her doorstep, watching until they disappeared around the corner. Then she turned and walked into her building, greeted by the familiar smell of Mrs. Patel's cooking from down the hall. In her apartment, Mr. Whiskers wound enthusiastically around her ankles, demanding attention. Rose scooped him up, burying her face in his fur. You wouldn't believe the past 2 days if I told you, she murmured to the cat. And I'm not sure anyone else would either. 3 weeks later, Rose pushed open the door to Pete's diner, the familiar bell chiming above her head. The morning rush had ended, and only a few regulars occupied the booths. Betty waved from behind the counter. "Your usual spot's open," she called out. Rose slid onto her regular stool, accepting the coffee Betty poured without asking. So much had changed, yet some things remained wonderfully constant. "Blueberry muffin?" Betty asked. "Actually, I'm waiting for someone." Betty raised an eyebrow but didn't comment. Rose sipped her coffee, remembering that morning 3 weeks ago when a seemingly homeless veteran had counted out his change for half a cup of coffee. The memory felt simultaneously distant and immediate. The bell above the door chimed. Rose turned to see Tom enter, but he wasn't alone. Holding his hand was a small girl with dark braided hair and his same blue eyes. "Rose," Tom said, guiding the child forward. "This is Amy." Rose smiled warmly. "Hello, Amy. I've heard so much about you." Amy studied Rose with the frank curiosity of an 8-year-old. "Daddy says you helped him when he was lost." Rose glanced at Tom, understanding the simplified explanation he must have given his daughter. "We helped each other." They settled into a booth, Amy between the two adults. They ordered pancakes, the same special Rose had bought for Tom during their first meeting. As they ate, Amy chattered about her new school, her bedroom in the house on Oak Street, her stuffed animals that had just arrived from her aunt's home in Colorado. "Dad's teaching me to fish," Amy announced proudly. "We're going to the lake on Saturday." "That sounds wonderful," Rose replied, watching the transformation in Tom as he listened to his daughter. The haunted look in his eyes had faded, replaced by something lighter, more present. While Amy was distracted by the coloring page Betty had brought her, Tom leaned closer to Rose. "The investigation is moving forward. Reeves will face trial next month. 5 other conspirators have been identified. Will you need to testify?" He nodded. "But I won't be alone this time." Their fingers brushed briefly on the table, a small touch, full of meaning. "I start back at the clinic tomorrow," Rose said. "Everyone thinks I had a family emergency. It's strange having this secret life that no one knows about. Not everyone gets to be part of saving national security over breakfast," Tom replied with a hint of humor. Amy looked up from her coloring. "Daddy says we should always be kind to people because you never know their story. Like how you were kind to him." Rose felt a lump in her throat. "That's very true." As they finished their meal, sunlight streamed through the diner windows, casting a warm glow over their table. Outside, Riverdale continued its peaceful small-town rhythm. No one who passed by would guess that within these walls, over simple pancakes and coffee, a story of courage, redemption, and unexpected connection had unfolded. "Same time next Sunday?" Tom asked as they prepared to leave. Rose nodded. "I'd like that. Very much." Walking home later, Rose reflected on how a single moment of kindness, buying breakfast for a stranger, had changed the course of so many lives, including her own. It hadn't been an entirely smooth journey, with danger and uncertainty along the way. But standing here now, with the promise of Sunday breakfasts with Tom and Amy, with the knowledge that her simple action had helped bring a father back to his daughter and dangerous conspirators to justice, Rose knew one thing for certain. She would buy that breakfast again in a heartbeat.